Monica, Philip, how many years have you aged in the last 100 days? Please show your math.
Okay, I woke up this morning for the first time in my life having experienced a neck injury while sleeping. So I think that puts me at a solid 20 plus years older than I was back in January.
I'm very pleased to say I've only aged a year in the past 100 days, but that's simply because over the past decade, I've aged 2 centuries. And so the rate at which I'm aging is actually slowed down, which I think is good news relative to the bad news that surrounds us.
So I've calculated I'm aging 1 year per week. So I am 14.29 years older, which
so it's
means
like double dog years.
So, yeah, exactly. Double
Yeah.
dog. And I will be 268 by the end of Trump's term. So it's a great thing that RFK Jr. is making America healthy again, because I'm going to need it.
Well, once they remove the dyes, we'll all start aging in reverse.
This is Impromptu from Washington Post Opinions, a show that brings you conversations about the news we can't stop thinking about despite desperate attempts at mindfulness and meditation. I'm Dana Milbank, and this week we're doing something a little different. We are exactly 100 days into President Trump's second term, and it has been a lot. He has the lowest approval ratings of any president at this point since the dawn of polling. His tariffs have brought a healthy economy to the cusp of recession. He has presided over the lowest legislative output in at least a century. He has failed in his promise to end wars overseas. He's alienated our allies, emboldened China and Russia, and just propelled the Liberals to a come-from-behind win in Canada. His extra-legal executive orders have been slapped down more than 100 times by courts, including by Trump-appointed judges, but he is defying their rulings. But otherwise, things are great. So today, we're going to go through the highs, if we can think of any, and the many lows, sorting the ruinous from the merely problematic. I'm here with my esteemed colleagues, Philip Bump and Monica Hesse, to talk through our top picks. Monica, Philip, welcome to Impromptu.
I feel awesome. We're off to a great start.
Agreed.
All right, we're going to start with one of the most competitive categories. What is the scariest thing Trump has done in his first 100 days? Scare me.
I'm going to go with a sort of Al Capone tax fraud answer. I thought really hard, but I think that Doge having access to financial documents and Social Security is where I'm going, because I think that that's where you start to worry, can bank accounts be frozen? Can money be taken away? Can people be prevented from their citizenship? Can people be prevented from having the funds to leave the country? So it's not the most gruesome and it's not the most flashy, but the interference in government websites, particularly holding access to Social Security information and finances, I think it's a stealth scary act.
Mm-hmm. Not to mention our nuclear secrets they've got now.
I want to start by saying that I don't like to talk about this in the context of what's frightening, because part of the aim is for Donald Trump to have his opponents feel as though they are frightened. So that said, I think the most disconcerting thing is sort of the umbrella here, which is the extent to which he has undercut American stability, right? So we have seen him via his proxies undercut American health, do enormous damage to America's research capacity and to the desire for foreign researchers to come to the United States. We've seen him absolutely gut fairness in how the government actually applies to American citizens. All of these aspects of what has made America robust and strong and growing over time, he's attacked them systematically without apparently facing any consequences for doing so.
All right. I like your amendment. We're not scared. We are disconcerted.
Frustrated. There's lots of adjectives.
Okay. I am most disconcerted over due process, because I think that's at the core of the unconstitutionality and the illegality. Mostly we see it in the deportation area now. So that's just picking one, but it was an embarrassment of riches there. But what about the dumbest thing, would you say, that Trump has done in his first 100 days, however you'd like to define it?
I mean, I think the lowest hanging fruit here is tariffs, but It's such low-hanging fruit that it's already getting bruised from being on the ground. So I will go for the second lowest-hanging fruit, which is Pete Hegseth, who is emblematic of the extent to which Donald Trump put zero thought into staffing his administration with people who are actually qualified to do so. Hegseth is the most obvious example of the way in which this has been a failure, where he's just sort of plucked loyalists who have been successful in the information sphere that engulfs the right and put them in charge of very important things. RFK Jr. is, obviously another example, but Hegseth is just such an utter failure and such an embarrassment, and yet there's no path out for the administration because they can't admit that he's a total failure. And, it's just like to appoint him in the first place was a dumb move, and to stick with him now just compounds the dumbness in a pretty remarkable way.
I'm going to go Trump naming himself the chair of the Kennedy Center.
Forgot about that one.
Because it's such a naked display of the need that he feels to be the center of all attention, and such a naked display of the need he feels to be loved and the embarrassment and shame he felt during his first term being rejected by the artistic establishment. He's trying to look powerful and control the cultural conversation, but in a way it's only displaying the fact that he knows he is irrelevant to the cultural conversation. The people who make art in America don't like him, and he can't stand that. It's like a really dumb kind of middle school move, but I considered it for my most dangerous move, too, because it's also a way of trying to control American culture, control the stories we tell about ourselves and the way that we tell those stories, which is something that he's also modeling in the Smithsonian and trying to develop his garden of heroes at the White House. And all of those are things that we can laugh about, but those are the things that end up rewriting history books. So there's it's like a bozo move with an undercurrent of real nefariousness.
Yeah, I guess dumb and scary are two sides of the same coin. I think I would add to this, I think the single dumbest move is Elon Musk, full stop. And yeah, it's been plenty ruinous in the short term, but I just, this study that was just out this week, that the Doge efforts have cost the federal government $135 billion. And even according to Doge's own estimates, which have to be inflated, they've saved $160 billion. So we're now talking about all of this for $25 billion. They haven't saved a penny, just caused a lot of mayhem. All right. This one, I think, is the hardest one of all of those that we have to answer today. And that is, what is the best thing that Trump or his administration has done so far?
Okay. You have to answer this one in a sideways manner. So I hope this isn't a cheat code, but I think that the best thing that's happened is that some of the acts have been so egregious that they really have forced people to clarify their own moral boundaries and what they will and they won't stand for. And I think that you see some of that in the shifting opinion polls related to immigration, how he started off with a lot of people saying, yeah, we need to be harder on this. Yeah, I support what he's doing. And then when you see the cases of the Maryland man wrongly deported and still in El Salvador, and people who thought that this was a good thing are beginning to come around to seeing that this is in fact a very bad thing, or the ways that the administration has gone about it, sending planefuls of people against judges' orders to extrajudicial prisons in El Salvador is actually maybe a bad thing. So I think that the good is in the American response to it rather than in the administration's intent.
Right. So almost the good thing is almost the excesses because of the backlash it's caused.
Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps predictably, I was aimed in the same direction here. I mean, I think that the past 100 days have really proven to be a clarifier for people's political and moral worldviews, right? That the Trump administration, his second term in office, has really proven just how hollow the rhetoric of the populist right is, and just how weak and poorly undergirded it is as rhetoric, right? We have seen that his process, his approach of pulling arguments and people from the right-wing conversational sphere is just a failure, and that it produces lousy policy results, it produces lousy staffing results. And I think that it has forced a lot of the people who are trying to play the sort of middle ground of, well, I'm a Republican, I don't really love Trump, but, I'm glad he's in office, it's going to be a golden era. It's really forced them to be like, oh, okay, no, there's no middle space anymore for those sorts of people to occupy, or at least it is eroding extremely quickly. And I think that's very useful, and I think it'll prove useful to Donald Trump's opponents over time.
So we've smoked them out. Yeah, I guess I'm in the same category as well as Monica here. He didn't wind up firing Jay Powell, at least so far. He backed down on the reciprocal tariff. So I guess the good things are like when you've been banging your head against the wall, it feels good when you stop. So we'll give credit for that. All right, who or what has mounted the best defense against Trump so far?
I would say the Bernie Sanders AOC tour, which has proven both that there is a huge population of people that is willing to come out and express their dissatisfaction with Trump, even in very red places. I think it has also been forced the Democratic Party itself to go on defense to some extent for having failed to put anything together. Sanders and AOC, neither of them is a traditional Democrat, and so they're able to do things outside of the auspices of the Democratic Party. But it really puts pressure on the Democratic Party to be like, okay, we've got to do something too. Not that they've done a whole lot yet in response, but it adds that pressure to the other side of the equation as well. And I think it's been very successful from that regard.
That's almost exactly what I was going to say. So if you can just add me as a ditto to Phil.
Ditto. All right. Mine is a tie between Mark Carney, who just had a smashing come-from-behind victory in Canada. They've learned how to campaign against Trump. And Harvard University, I hate to say that as a Yale guy, but I think they've rallied higher education in a way and brought conservative lawyers into play in a way that really is starting to feel like a turning point. All right. What has happened in the first 100 days that we are not talking about enough?
I think that we are so bowled over by the endless influx of executive orders and policies that I think that the cultural shift is sneaking up on us. And I'm talking about a cultural shift of quote unquote traditional families, trad wives, the idea kind of subtly sold by J.D. Vance and his ilk that there's one way that an American family should look, and it should look like a mom, a dad, and a lot of kids, unless you're Elon Musk, in which case we don't need to go into that. But I think that the idea of America as a melting pot is disappearing as a goal. I think the goal of this administration is America as a homogenous traditional family. And that's something that can't really be codified by policy, but is a kind of sneaky thing to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think we're probably spending less time than we ought to be talking about the extent to which Donald Trump has turned the presidency into a grift. And I think that's in part rooted on our understanding that he's a hustler and a huckster and has been for a long time. So we see him do these things and it just sort of like, yeah, of course he's doing that. Of course he's doing a meme coin. Of course his sons are establishing some sort of club in Washington where you have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to be a member and, administration officials will roll up. Of course he's doing those sorts of things, but it's important to note that he is. I wrote a newsletter this week that looked, for example, at the ways in which Donald Trump is trying to turn the White House into sort of his own, Mar-a-Lago North, as opposed to the White House South, which he's referred to Mar-a-Lago as, just putting out giant tacky flagpoles and putting in a patio for events in the Rose Garden and doing all these sorts of things where he is assuming an ownership of the White House that is at odds with tradition, certainly, but also just a way for him to try and run the whole thing in a way that helps him line his pockets, which is the way that he's approached the presidency basically since 2017, but so explicitly this time and so egregiously, but we're almost inured to it. So I think it's worth stopping and saying, hey, this is not how a president ought to president.
All right. After the break, we'll talk about whether the public attitude toward President Trump has changed in the last 100 days. Don't go away. Welcome back. I'm Dana Milbank, and this is Impromptu. So, do you guys think we have passed peak Trump crazy? Or am I a little too optimistic on that one?
Every time I think that surely something has happened that means we will have passed it, I'm wrong. I think that we are pretty much in a place where the people who love him will continue to love him. The people who don't will continue to not. And we're really talking about the few people who are at the margins, who are the people who said, I really did think that gas prices would get lower. I really did think that egg prices would get lower. And I don't like him. And also, eggs still cost a lot. So
I thought they were 94% cheaper.
I'm sort of beyond the point of expecting to see big shifts in any directions. I think we're talking about the margins at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, out of the blue over the weekend, he's like, oh, we're going to go back to Columbus Day, which, of course, we never went away from. But it is a sign that as he's seeing these bad poll numbers come in, which he had been as these 100-day polls are coming out, he's sort of reaching out for ways in which he can energize people and get excited about him and his presidency. And I think that's my concern, is that we're going to see, as his numbers continue to decline, as his policies continue to be embarrassments, and because he's incapable of saying, oh, I screwed up and this is bad, right? Because he can't do that, he has to come up with some other, either a rationalization for changing his mind or some sort of distraction. And I think that's the concern that I have, is that, I lived in California when Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor there, and he embarked on this, I think it was 2005, this effort to sort of reshape all of the state government, and it failed spectacularly. He put it before the voters and it failed, and he was chastened, and he became a much different governor after that point. Trump is incapable of doing that, and I worry that he will continue to do more and more unstable things as he feels as though his grip on the populace is weakening.
Yeah, I've always thought the craziest thing Trump has done is whatever he's going to do tomorrow that we don't yet know about. And I was just thinking about this in Monday's White House press briefing when one of these, the first questioner was some right-wing YouTube guy say, how about suspending habeas corpus?
Yeah.
And Levitt's like, oh, well, we haven't thought of that one yet, but everything should be on the table. And you could see, bells going off in the White House. Wait, we forgot to suspend habeas corpus. All right. So we sort of agree that not past peak crazy. We've been through 100 days of this. Can the country survive another 1,361 days?
Well, I think the country can survive, but I think it's pretty obvious that the country is going to be very different on January 20th, 2029 than it is now. And I think the real question is just how different. Right. I mean, there will still be a United States of America, I think it's safe to say, which is, a weird this whole period reminds me of, I remember having a conversation with Post people in February of 2020, and we were talking about the conventions that year. And I was like, well, if there's going to be conventions because COVID was looming, it just feels like that's the exact same space we're in. Like, we know something awful is coming and some shift will occur. We just have no sense of scale. So yeah, will the country exist? Yes. So will the earth and the sun. And those are the only predictions I'm comfortable in making.
Yeah, I was talking to a neighbor at a potluck this weekend, and she said that the biggest hope she had for an America had started to feel like a sort of depressing hope, because she no longer hoped for things to get better. She just hoped that when they got worse, they would feel less crazy. And that while the chaos might eventually subside and that we would run out of executive orders and things might feel a little bit calmer, they would feel calmer in a deeply changed way. And I think that that's how I sort of feel too, is just how are we going to grit our teeth through all of this? And then when it's over, how are we going to figure out what can be repaired and what's lost?
Well, I'm tempted to say that they will simply run out of shocking new things to do, but I recognize that's dangerous territory. But I like to think of it in terms of baby steps. Like, I have recently gained some confidence and pleasure in saying, you know what, there are going to be elections next year. Because I'm not sure I was always taking that for granted. So, okay, baby steps. So we'll get through to the midterms and we'll see what happens from there. All right, on a slightly, possibly more positive note, we talked a bit about the polling earlier. Do you think the public attitude toward Trump has fundamentally shifted in some enduring way over these last 100 years? I know this is sort of your hobby, Philip.
Yeah. I appreciate you said over the last 100 years inadvertently, which I think is a good callback to the start of the show here. Yeah, I think unquestionably. I mean, new incoming presidents often see this decline, the end of the honeymoon period, as it's often called. But I also think there is a role being played here by Donald Trump being such a disaster, right? You know, obviously he and his allies will not say it's a disaster. I think objectively speaking, we can say it's been a disaster. And I think that's being reflected in the polls. And I don't know how he reclaims immigration, for example. How does he reclaim the mantle of being like the guy who deals well with immigration when people are seeing the effects of his immigration policy and looking at them negatively? Like the economy, I think he can probably stabilize on that. But I think the damage is done. And it's going to get worse, you know, as shipping containers stop arriving from China, which is imminent, right? Like things are going to get worse over the short term. And I think it's going to be very hard for him to rebound from that.
What do you think? Is this turnaroundable, Monica?
I've completely given up predicting that. But I will say, I think that the benefit of this go-round of the administration is that we spent his first term talking about, like, well, there are these adults in the room. John Kelly is in the room. There are these serious people in the room keeping the guardrails on. And now I think we're seeing what it looks like when the guardrails are off. And in a way, I think that the biggest chance of public opinion changing is that we're getting pure, unadulterated Trump. And so it gives people, you know, really a chance to see if this is what they wanted. And I know, and as Philip said, in a lot of polls, we're seeing that people are realizing, oh, it's not. I thought it was, but I didn't expect it to look like this.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me he could turn it around, but it would involve more surrender. Like, okay, sorry, this trade war was a terrible idea. We're going back to the way things were before. That could turn things around, but I guess that's the fundamental question. Has the American public, including a chunk of MAGA voters, finally decided this is not the guy we thought it was, do you think?
I think that the tricky thing about that is that the question is sort of built on the premise that we all have access to the same information, that
Right,
the people who really support him are reading the same kinds of news as the people who really don't. And I don't want to get too existential or depressing, but there are huge swaths of the country in which Trump is doing great. And he's doing great because the news that they watch says that he's doing great. And in the areas that he's not doing great, it's because the liberals are preventing him from doing great. So I think that that's why I have a really hard time of picturing the whole country coming together and having the scales lifted from our eyes as we all envision things in the same way. Because I think that there's a way to move through the world in which Trump is the greatest president you've ever seen.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think, too, the question is predicated on two things that we have evidence for. The first is, will Trump change? We have evidence to suggest that, no, he won't at any point in time. And the other is, you know, is it possible for his approval numbers to shift substantially? And we have an entire first term in which we saw that they didn't.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. But if Republicans, you know, facing their own hanging next year, feel like he no longer has the clout among the base, if that's slipping, then he won't be able to push through his big tax cut bill, generating worse results. But anyway, I'm just clutching at straws here to try to take a couple fewer years off of my life. But thank you guys for cheering me up a bit and for informing our listeners. And with that, we've got to wrap this up. Thank you both for joining this episode of Impromptu.
Of course.
Thanks, Dana. Anytime.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson and Regina DeHeer, edited by Damir Marusic and Chris Solentrop, and mixed by Emma Munger. Special thanks to Mili Mitra and Deirdre Byrne. Thanks for listening to Impromptu. Please share your superlatives from the Trump administration's first 100 days. Send an email to impromptu@washpost.com. And remember, Impromptu is now twice a week. I'm here on Tuesdays to talk politics, and my colleagues Drew Gawns and Molly Roberts take the mic on Fridays. See you next week.